Imagine a man who had enough power to change the destiny of millions, but who, at the end of the day, sat alone writing reminders to himself, not about achievements, but about how not to lose himself inside. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and perhaps the most unsettling question that runs through his writings is this: why, even when everything seems under control, does something within us remain restless? We enter life with a kind of silent tension. It's not clear pain, nor evident suffering. It's a diffuse feeling that something is missing. From an early age, we learn to deal with this by looking outward. We believe that the world, if well organized, can offer us what we don't find within. So we begin to pile up goals, expectations, plans. We create future versions of ourselves where finally everything will make sense, and without realizing it, we transform the present into a temporary place. Marcus Aurelius observed this movement within himself. Even surrounded by power, wealth, and recognition, he perceived that his mind remained restless. This led him to an uncomfortable realization. The hunger we feel does not stem from a lack of things, but from the constant attempt to control what was never in our hands. The more we seek external guarantees, the more fragile our inner center becomes. There is a conflict we rarely name. On one side, life as it is, unstable, unpredictable, indifferent. On the other, our silent demand that it be fair, predictable, and comfortable. It is in this friction that unease grows, not because life fails us, but because we insist on asking it for something it never promised to deliver. Perhaps that's why so many people feel tired even without physical exertion, a tiredness that comes from sustaining unrealistic expectations, from carrying the weight of an idealized future. We live as if we are always behind schedule for a better version of life, and meanwhile the present goes unnoticed, treated only as a means to an end. Marcus Aurelius wrote to remind himself of something simple yet difficult. Nothing outside of yourself can offer lasting stability. Yet we keep trying. We buy more, seek more approval, more control, more certainty, and when none of that works, we believe the problem is us, that we haven't done enough yet. Here arises an uncomfortable question. What if the error lies not in the intensity of your search, but in its direction? What if this constant hunger is not a personal flaw, but a sign that you have been trained to look in the wrong place? Marcus Aurelius did not see this hunger as something to be eliminated, but understood. For him, the danger was not in feeling the lack of something, but in surrendering one's peace to future promises. There is a silent moment when we realize we are always waiting, waiting for life to begin, waiting to be ready, waiting to feel safe. This state of waiting creates a profound internal conflict. We are alive, but not present. We function, but we do not inhabit the experience itself. And perhaps the most disturbing thing is realizing that no one forces us to live like this. It's a silent agreement we make with ourselves, an agreement based on the idea that further down the line, it will all be worth it. Marcus Aurelius deeply distrusted this logic. He knew that the human mind is skilled at postponing life in the name of an abstract promise. If this sounds familiar, it's no coincidence. This unease spans centuries because it stems from the same root. The question isn't why we feel empty sometimes. The real question is, why do we insist on believing that something external will definitively solve this? Perhaps the hardest part is admitting that this hunger won't be satisfied in the way we've been taught. And if that's the case, something needs to change. Not in the world, not in the circumstances, but in the way we relate to this inner restlessness. Before moving forward, it's worth facing this tension without rushing. Because what you call emptiness may not be a problem to be filled, but an invitation to look inward with more honesty. And when that perspective begins to change, an inevitable question approaches, silent, almost uncomfortable. If the world never promised to take care of your peace, why do you continue to surrender it to it? There's a silent shock when we realize that life doesn't react to our intentions. You make plans, you strive, you try to act correctly, and yet something goes wrong. A delay that changes the whole day. an answer that doesn't come, a loss that wasn't in the calculations. It's not a major disaster. It's something small, everyday, but enough to reveal an uncomfortable truth. The world doesn't adjust to our internal script. Marcus Aurelius lived with this daily. Wars, diseases, political betrayals, the death of children. Yet, he didn't write to complain about the harshness of reality. He wrote to remind himself not to demand from it what it never promised to offer. For him, the most common human error was not suffering, but arguing with the inevitable, as if that would change anything. Consider a simple example. You wake up already tired, even after sleeping. The day starts late. The traffic is terrible. Someone answers curtly. None of this is serious in isolation, but something inside you begins to tense. The irritation grows, not because the events are extraordinary, but because silently you expected the day to be different. You expected fluidity, collaboration, predictability. When this doesn't happen, internal conflict arises. Marcus Aurelius would say that this is precisely where the mind deceives itself. We are not irritated by the event itself, but by the frustrated expectation we carried without realizing it. Reality simply followed its course. What created the friction was the internal demand that it should act differently. This pattern repeats itself on a larger scale. You dedicate yourself to a relationship expecting constant understanding. The person fails. You throw yourself into your work expecting proportional recognition. It doesn't come. Gradually, a feeling of injustice sets in, and then a dangerous question arises. What did I do wrong? Often the honest answer is nothing. The mistake is not in the action, but in the belief that acting correctly guarantees emotional reward. For Marcus Aurelius, this type of thinking was a continuous source of psychological strain. He understood that the world is impersonal by nature, not cruel, not kind, just indifferent. This indifference doesn't mean abandonment. It means that life doesn't revolve around our emotional needs. There's something liberating about that, even though it seems harsh at first glance. When you stop expecting the world to take care of your inner stability, you begin to realize where choice still exists, not in the responses of others, not in events, but in how you receive them. Imagine two people facing the same situation, an unexpected job loss. For one, it becomes humiliation, loss of identity, and internal collapse. For the other, pain and fear exist, but they don't translate into personal destruction. The fact is the same. The internal impact is not. The difference lies not in strength, but in the relationship with what is beyond their control. Marcus Aurelius trained his mind precisely for this point, not to become insensitive, but to avoid internal disarray every time something external changed. He knew that demanding emotional justice from the world is a battle lost from the start. Perhaps that's why so many people feel exhausted without knowing why. They're not tired of life itself, but of the constant attempt to adjust it to their own expectations. It's like swimming against an invisible current. The more you insist, the more strength you lose. There's a surprising understanding at play. When you accept that the world doesn't owe you stability, something starts to reorganize itself inside. The mind becomes less reactive. The body relaxes a little faster. Frustrations don't disappear, but they cease to dominate everything. This doesn't mean giving up, settling, or passively accepting injustice. It simply means stopping confusing reality with emotional obligation. Life happens. You respond. That's the only point where psychological dignity still exists. And perhaps the most difficult point is this. If the world never promised to be predictable, why do you continue to surrender your peace to this non-existent promise? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply lingers, creating a slight discomfort, a necessary discomfort, because when you face this honestly, something begins to change. And when that change deepens, a new, even more unsettling question approaches. If the world doesn't control your mind, why do you allow it to guide you so easily? There is a type of movement that doesn't produce progress. It only consumes energy. It's when the mind races faster than life itself. It plans, anticipates, revises, compares. It lives a few days ahead of the body, as if the present moment were always insufficient. Many people don't perceive this as a problem because they are too busy calling this state productivity or responsibility. But inside, something begins to wear down. Marcus Aurelius observed this phenomenon attentively. He realized that the human mind has a natural tendency to escape the present, especially when the present offers no guarantees. We think about what is still missing, what could go wrong, what we need to achieve to finally relax. The problem is that this relaxation almost never arrives. The mind learns to live in a constant state of alert. Stop for a moment and observe a typical day. You wake up, and before even getting out of bed, you're already mentally focused on what you need to do. Breakfast is rushed. Your body is in one place, but your mind is in another. At the end of the day, a strange feeling of tiredness arises, even though nothing physically exhausting has happened. It's not your body that's tired. It's your mind that hasn't rested at all. Have you ever noticed how many times you go through the whole day without really being present in it? This pattern repeats itself because we've been taught to believe that always thinking about the next step is a sign of maturity. Marcus Aurelius saw this as a silent mistake. For him, living projected into the future weakens the mind, not strengthens it. When we depend on tomorrow for relief, we transform today into a problem to be solved, not an experience to be lived. There is also another, less obvious aspect. The more the mind chases after future versions of itself, the greater the feeling of inadequacy becomes. There is always something missing. There is always someone further ahead. There is always an unachieved goal. This kind of constant comparison creates a continuous, almost invisible, but profoundly exhausting internal conflict. How many decisions do you make today just so you don't feel left behind tomorrow? Marcus Aurelius understood that this state of perpetual racing doesn't stem from ambition itself, but from fear. Fear of wasting time, fear of not being enough, fear of falling behind in a game that no one has properly explained. The problem is that this fear disguises itself as discipline. The person believes they are being responsible, when in reality they are merely reacting to an internal pressure that is never satisfied. There's a significant pattern break here. The most powerful emperor of his time wrote repeatedly about the importance of slowing down internally, not externally. He wasn't talking about abandoning duties, but about not allowing the mind to be dragged down by them. It's about fulfilling what needs to be done without sacrificing one's own emotional stability as payment. What if the problem isn't the quantity of things you do, but the way your mind engages with them? This changes how we view progress. Moving forward doesn't mean running faster. Sometimes it means stopping running away from silence, from the absence of stimulation, from the feeling of not producing anything visible. Many people keep themselves busy because they can't stand being alone with their own thoughts. Marcus Aurelius considered this a clear sign of inner disorganization. When the mind learns to remain in the present without anxiety, something curious happens. Actions become simpler, decisions become less impulsive, mistakes cease to be a personal attack. Success doesn't become identity. This doesn't eliminate challenges, but it completely changes the relationship with them. Can you remember the last time you did something without being mentally somewhere else? Perhaps the most uncomfortable point is admitting that this constant race wasn't imposed from the outside. It was internalized. Little by little you learned that you are only valuable when you are advancing, improving, overcoming something. Marcus Aurelius questioned exactly that. He knew that a mind that never rests also never stabilizes. Upon noticing this pattern, a new tension arises. If you stop running, who will you be? If you're not always striving for the next level, what's left? This question is frightening because it reveals how much identity has been tied to movement. But it is precisely there that something begins to open up. What if learning to stop wasn't stagnation, but the beginning of deeper control? This reflection doesn't close anything yet. It merely shifts the perspective. Because when you begin to realize how much you depend on external events to feel alive, an even more delicate question arises. If you don't depend so much on tomorrow to exist, on what exactly does your peace depend? This question cannot be answered now. It prepares the ground for the next step. There's a mental exercise that Marcus Aurelius frequently practiced, and which sounds almost strange today, imagining his own life without the comforts he considered guaranteed. Not as punishment, but as training. He would silently wonder if he could still remain stable if certain conveniences disappeared. Not because I expected it to happen, but because I knew that dependence creates invisible fragility. This type of practice reveals something profound about the human mind. Modern studies show that much of everyday anxiety is not linked to extreme events, but to the loss of perceived comfort. Small changes, such as being without a cell phone for a few hours or breaking a routine, are enough to increase stress. This doesn't happen because these things are vital, but because the brain learns to treat them as such. Marcus Aurelius observed this centuries before any statistics existed. He knew that the more the mind associates stability with external factors, the more vulnerable it becomes. Therefore, he trained himself to be well without depending on them. Not to live in scarcity, but to avoid being dominated by the fear of loss. Think of something simple, a day without internet. For many, this generates immediate irritation, restlessness, a feeling of emptiness. It's not the internet that's missed, it's the silence it used to fill. The discomfort arises when the distraction disappears and the person is forced to be alone. What exactly bothers us when comfort disappears? Historical records show that Marcus Aurelius, even as emperor, slept in simple conditions during military campaigns and maintained austere habits even when he could have lived in excess. This was not a virtue displayed, it was a psychological strategy. He understood that excess weakens the mind by creating a continuous dependence on stimulation and pleasure. In today's world, this manifests itself in other ways. People who can't rest without guilt, who feel empty when they're not being productive, who need constant validation to feel secure. The more these emotional crutches accumulate, the harder it becomes to remove them without suffering. Have you ever noticed how small deprivations can reveal deep dependencies? There's a curious finding in well-being research. People who practice voluntary exposure to mild discomfort, such as material simplicity, consciously reducing stimuli, or periods of silence, show greater emotional tolerance to unexpected stress, not because they suffered more, but because they learned that they can remain whole even when something is lacking. Marcus Aurelius would call this the strengthening of character, not in a moral sense, but a structural one. A character that doesn't fall apart in the face of absence, that doesn't panic when it loses something external. This stability doesn't arise from hardness, but from familiarity with what is essential. There's a little-known story about him. During a devastating epidemic in the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius lost loved ones, faced political instability, and saw resources dwindle. Yet, his writings from this period don't speak of despair. They speak of inner discipline, of remembering repeatedly that what sustains the mind cannot depend on favorable circumstances. This is a breaking point in the common narrative. We are taught to seek comfort as the highest priority, to avoid discomfort at all costs. But what Marcus Aurelius realized is that the constant avoidance of discomfort makes the mind fragile. Any loss becomes an existential threat. Any absence becomes a crisis. When you learn that you can navigate small gaps without collapsing, something changes, fear diminishes, anxiety loses its power, not because life has become more predictable, but because you've stopped placing all your stability on it. What part of you becomes disorganized when something external fails? This practice doesn't require radicalism. It's not about abandoning everything or living in deprivation. It's about gradually testing where you truly depend too much. Perhaps it's silence, perhaps it's recognition, perhaps it's control. By observing this, you begin to distinguish real need from emotional habit. And here comes an important surprise. When dependence diminishes, gratitude becomes clearer. Comfort ceases to be a requirement and becomes a choice. Pleasure ceases to be an escape and becomes appreciation. Marcus Aurelius knew that only those who are not dependent are able to enjoy life without fear. This realization sets the stage for something deeper. When you don't need things so much to feel good, you begin to look inward with more honesty, and it's at this point that the next inevitable tension arises. If what affects you most isn't the events themselves, but how you interpret them, where exactly does the real conflict begin? There is a common misconception when we think about suffering. We believe it stems directly from events, a loss, a rejection, a failure, as if the emotional impact were an automatic consequence of what occurred. Marcus Aurelius dedicated a large part of his life to dismantling this illusion. He knew that between the event and the pain lies something almost invisible, yet decisive: judgment. Two soldiers can return from the same battle. One carries the weight of guilt and anger for years. The other feels sadness, but moves forward with clarity. The battlefield was the same. What changed was the interpretation. Marcus Aurelius observed that the human mind rarely suffers from what happens, but from the meaning it attributes to what happens. That is where the real conflict arises. In everyday life, this appears subtly: a criticism at work, an unexpected silence from someone important, a plan that doesn't come to fruition. The event is simple, but the mind begins to construct a narrative. This says something about me. This proves I failed. This will never change. But in a few seconds, the fact ceases to be a fact and becomes an internal sentence. Have you ever noticed how a single thought can transform an entire day? Marcus Aurelius trained himself to interrupt this process. He neither denied reality nor feigned indifference. He simply separated what happened from the story his mind wanted to tell about it. For him, this was the true battlefield, the moment when the mind decides how to interpret the world. There's a curious finding in contemporary studies on stress. People subjected to the same events exhibit completely different levels of suffering depending on their initial interpretation. It's not the intensity of the event that defines the psychological impact, but the speed with which the mind transforms it into a personal threat. Marcus Aurelius understood this intuitively, long before any research. Think about how we deal with time. The clock ticks, the years go by, the body changes. For some, this generates despair. For others, it generates sobriety. Time itself doesn't hurt. What hurts is the story we tell ourselves about it. I'm late. I missed opportunities. Things should be different already. How many pains do you carry that are, in fact, repeated narratives? The emperor knew that trying to control events is futile. Life will continue to be uncertain, unstable, often unfair. What can be trained is how the mind reacts to it. He wrote to himself as someone who needs to be constantly reminded not to exaggerate the weight of things, not to transform difficulties into identity. There is something profoundly liberating about this. When you realize that you don't have to agree with every thought that arises, your relationship with pain changes. It continues to exist, but it doesn't spread. It doesn't consume everything. Suffering ceases to be a permanent state and becomes a localized experience. However, this understanding brings discomfort. If the suffering lies not in the facts, but in their interpretation, then part of the responsibility returns to you, not as guilt, but as conscience. Marcus Aurelius did not see this as a burden, but as dignity. The dignity of not surrendering one's own mind to external chaos. Observe how we react to losses. Often, what hurts the most is not what was lost, but what we believe that loss says about us. Without this, I'm not enough. Without this, my life loses its meaning. These phrases don't come from reality, they come from judgment. What if part of your suffering wasn't in what happened, but in the meaning you insist on clinging to? This mental training doesn't eliminate emotions. Sadness, fear, and frustration continue to appear. The difference is that they don't govern everything. Marcus Aurelius understood that feeling isn't the problem. The problem is being dragged along without realizing it. When you learn to observe your own judgments, something changes in your relationship with time. The past loses some of its weight. The future loses some of its threat. The present ceases to be merely an interval between worries. Not because everything has become easy, but because the mind has stopped amplifying each event beyond what is necessary. This is a silent turning point. When you realize that the real conflict happens within, you stop fighting the world as if it were the enemy. And this prepares the ground for something even deeper. If what matters most is inner stability, what happens when you stop reacting automatically and start responding consciously? This answer doesn't come immediately. It requires something more difficult than external control, inner sobriety. And that's exactly what comes next in the next step. There comes a point when understanding is no longer enough. You can comprehend all the ideas, recognize the patterns, agree with every point, and still continue living the same way. Marcus Aurelius knew this. That's why he wrote to himself every day. Not to learn something new, but to remember what he already knew and hadn't yet lived. True clarity isn't intellectual, it's practical. It appears when you start acting differently in small, invisible moments where no one is watching. That's when philosophy ceases to be thought and becomes action. The world remains unstable. Losses are still possible. Frustrations don't disappear. What changes is how you position yourself in relation to them. Perhaps the most honest question now is simple. What to do with all this tomorrow, when the day begins as it always does? Not with grand decisions, but with details. The transformation that Marcus Aurelius advocated was not dramatic. It was discreet, repetitive, almost silent. The first step is learning to pause before reacting. This isn't about ignoring emotions. It's about creating a gap between the event and the response. When something gets out of control, and it will, observe the immediate impulse to judge, complain, or blame yourself. In that interval, simply ask yourself, is this under my control or not? If it isn't, insisting will only cost you energy. This simple gesture, repeated daily, reduces more suffering than any attempt to control the world. The second step is to practice separating fact from interpretation. Mentally note what happened objectively, without adjectives. Then observe the story your mind begins to construct. Often, the pain doesn't come from the event itself, but from the narrative that repeats itself automatically. Questioning this narrative doesn't eliminate the problem, but it prevents it from growing beyond what is necessary. The third step is to reduce invisible emotional dependencies, not all at once, just one. It could be the constant need for approval, the habit of continuous distraction, or the obsession with control. Choose a small, voluntary, temporary deprivation and observe how your mind reacts. This initial discomfort reveals where your stability was based. Over time, this practice generates a silent confidence. You realize that you remain whole, even without certain crutches. The fourth step is to redefine what you call success. Marcus Aurelius didn't measure a good life by comfort or recognition, but by inner consistency. Ask yourself honestly, are my actions aligned with the kind of person I want to be, even when no one is watching? This question doesn't require perfection, just direction. Making mistakes ceases to be failure and becomes a course correction. The fifth step is to remember daily what is beyond your control, not as resignation, but as freedom. When you stop demanding guarantees from life, you begin to act with more dignity. You do what needs to be done, accept what cannot be changed, and preserve your mind as a territory that cannot be invaded by any external event. None of this makes life easy. It makes it more bearable. Anxiety loses some of its power because it no longer encounters so much resistance. Fear diminishes because it no longer controls every decision. Peace ceases to be a future promise and becomes a present practice. If this content resonated with you, don't treat it as just another video watched. Choose one of these steps and try applying it today. even if imperfectly. Real change happens through repetition, not initial enthusiasm. If you feel that this type of reflection helps you organize your mind and better navigate your own conflicts, consider subscribing to the channel. Liking the video helps keep this content alive and reaching more people. And if you want, share a question, an experience, or a conflict you're going through in the comments. You can do this anonymously if you prefer. This space exists for genuine reflection, not for judgment. You don't need to solve everything right now. You just need to take the next step with more awareness. Sometimes that's enough to start changing the way you live.